Now we're going to start in talking about the circulatory system, and this is going to intersect with a lot of things that we've talked before, for instance, the endocrine system and stuff like that, and things that we're going to be talking about in the future, such as the respiratory system and things like that. So really, the circulatory system is another one, like the nervous system, that interacts with a lot of other physiological systems throughout the body. And so there are certain parts I'm going to talk a lot about, some parts I'm not going to talk so much about. We'll just kind of go through it and see how it goes. So really, the circulatory system, the purpose of this system is to really transport things around the body. Just get stuff from one place to the other. And we're doing that by essentially bulk movement. We're trying to actually move things rather than letting things diffuse through the body. We're trying to take actual material and push it around. So some of the things that we would be transporting through the body are nutrients, wastes, oxygen and other dissolved gases, things like signal molecules, particularly from the endocrine system. We're also going to be moving things around like immune system components, like white blood cells, other things like that. And then one thing you might not often think about and that's being transported around by the circulatory system is also heat. So it'll pick up heat from certain parts of the body and then move it to other parts of the body where it can be dissipated out of the body, or help heat up other further away parts of the body or things like that. So it's also moving heat around the body as well. So let's talk a little bit about the components of the parts of the circulatory system that we're going to be talking about. So first off, we can talk about in terms of components, what are the different things that make up the circulatory system. And then we have a fluid portion of that, the material that's actually going to be moved around. And in things like us, this is blood. Now, in animals, however, that do not have a closed circulatory system, this is going to be called something else. Now, blood is a specialized tissue that has been fine-tuned to transport a lot of these things that we're talking about. And we can specialize it because in a closed circulatory system, it's separated from all of our other tissues and all the other fluids that are in our body. However, if you have an open circulatory system, you can't separate the fluid component of your circulatory system from things like interstitial fluid and other things like that. So in animals that have an open circulatory system, this is called something else. It will be called hemolymph. So in us, blood. In other organisms such as crabs, octopuses, clams, things like that, this is going to be called hemolymph. We also have a vessel component of this. So in us, this is going to include things like arteries and veins. Whatever the tubes are that we're moving this fluid around the body. And in most organisms, we also have some sort of pump component, something that is going to be able to push around this fluid throughout the body as well. And in us, that is, of course, the heart. So these are the major components of the circulatory system. If we want to break it down kind of functionally into what the different parts are. But we can also divide this up into divisions as well. We have a cardiovascular system that includes the heart plus all the vessels. And then we also have a lymphatic system that is going to consist of lymph ducts and their associated anatomy. So this is going to be picking up unused interstitial fluid and then moving it back to a place that can be reintroduced generally back into the blood. So just as kind of a general, if you haven't ever seen a diagram of the circulatory system before, this is an illustration of the cardiovascular system. Again, here we have our heart, which is the pump of this. Then you can see the two sides of the vascular system moving throughout here, the red being arteries being any vessel that's moving away from the heart or carrying blood away from the heart before it hits a capillary bed, and then blue representing veins or any vessel that is taking blood from a capillary bed back to the heart. So that's really kind of the overview there. So let's talk just a little bit about the different portions of this that we're talking about. First off, the fluid portion. And in the fluid portion, or the blood, we have two different portions of that. A liquid portion of that, and then also a cellular component of that. The aqueous portion of this is known as plasma. And it's going to consist of several different things. First off, it's going to have water in it. Then also dissolved inorganic and organic ions in that. They're going to help it solve its job. Then we also have this cellular component like I was talking to you before. And we have several different kinds of cells that are in there. Erythrocytes, which are red blood cells. Leukocytes, which are white blood cells. And thrombocytes, which help in clotting. I'm going to talk a little bit more about those here in just a moment. But let's come back and focus in on the fluid component just for a moment. Oh, I should also mention, there's also this term hematocrit that we'll talk about perhaps in a little while. But just so you know what it is, hematocrit really is referring to the percent of, by volume, of your blood that is packed cell volume. So essentially, what proportion of the blood is the cellular component by volume? So we'll come back to that term, but it's one you need to know as we're going forward. So let's talk about the plasma component here just for a moment. And really, plasma is basically water with a few different things in it, but it's 90% water. The next biggest thing that we have in here are different proteins. That's coming in somewhere between 6 and 8%. After that, somewhere around 1%, we have a various range of inorganic ions. And then finally, we have nutrients, wastes, and dissolved gases that are taking up the last small amount of what's left in the plasma. So let's talk about some of these components in order. First off, plasma proteins. They have a whole bunch of functions, many of them being specific to the specific kinds of proteins that are in there. But they also have some just general non-specific functions, things that they just do. And one of the main ones is to maintain the osmotic pressure of the blood. And so a lot of these proteins are very large. They're in colloidal solution, or they're in a colloidal suspension in the blood. They're not coming out as we get rid of some of this fluid into the interstitial fluid. And so these big proteins are going to stay in there and maintain the osmotic pressure of the blood. Now that's really important because if you didn't maintain a very tight osmotic pressure of the blood, you could get far too much liquid leaving the blood or too much being pulled back in. And so we need to maintain that pretty tightly. But also it's going to help out in buffering, maintain the pH balance of the blood as well. Let's talk about some of the specific functions of some of these different proteins. Now, we've talked about some of them. We've talked about some signal molecule proteins that are in the blood. We've talked about some transporter ones for, like, the apolipoproteins as well that transport different sorts of lipophilic nutrients. But here are some other ones. We also have ones known as fibrinogen, which aids in clotting. We also have albumins. We've talked a little bit about these already, but albumins bind substances, generally lipophilic substances, and help them with transport. We also have several different types of globulins. So in general, alpha and beta globulins are transporters or clotting agents, or sometimes they're inactive hormones that need a part cleaved off before they become active. So, really these alpha and beta globulins run an entire gamut of different kinds of proteins that are suspended in the blood. But we also have gamma globulins, which are a component of the immune system. Really big important system, but since we have an entire class for that, I'm not really going to talk at all about the immune system in this class. Also, like we were talking about before, we also have the apolipoproteins that are useful in lipid transport as well. So we have, and this is just to name a few, we really have a large collection of different proteins that are suspended in the blood that have each of them very specific purposes and functions that they're carrying out. And so this is just a quick list of those. We also have a whole list of inorganic ions as well. But by far, the two most common are chloride and sodium. This is making up the vast majority of the inorganic ions in the blood. But we also have bicarbonate right here. And bicarbonate is one of the major ways that we're going to be transporting carbon dioxide. We'll come back and talk a little bit more about that later. Then we also have some potassium and calcium as well, and then a lot more inorganic ions, but these are really the 5 most important inorganic ions in the plasma. I also have a list of nutrients. I'm not going to cover these really because we've really talked quite a bit about what these nutrients are and why in the world they'd be in the blood in the first place. And then also we have a list of wastes as well, most of these being metabolic wastes, but other things like that. Things like creatinine, bilirubin, urea are also going to be dissolved in the plasma. And finally, this is something that we haven't talked a lot about, but we'll definitely come back and talk about this a lot more, especially when we get to talking about the respiratory system. We have a good amount of dissolved gases in the plasma as well, particularly oxygen, carbon dioxide. Okay, so that was the plasma, the aqueous component. We also have a cellular component, some cells that are specialized to be in the blood. The first one is erythrocytes. And these are red blood cells. Erythro meaning red, and cyte, of course, meaning type of cell. And these are going to be filled with hemoglobin, absolutely packed with hemoglobin. Now, hemoglobin is a respiratory pigment, and that's going to bind to oxygen. And that's the major function, the primary function of erythrocytes, is to bind and transport oxygen through the blood. Now, because these erythrocytes are so filled with hemoglobin, they actually have excluded all other organelles. So there's no nucleus, there's no ribosomes, there's no other organelles. Once they become mature, they've excluded all those things and just really packed themselves with hemoglobin. And this really seems that this is particularly in mammals. Now, in other organisms, like birds actually do have nuclei in their erythrocytes. Reptiles have nuclei in their erythrocytes, and really it looks like this is a special adaptation of mammals to make very, very small erythrocytes. And the reason we want to have small erythrocytes is so we can have smaller capillaries, so we can have more efficient delivery of oxygen to all of our tissues. We can actually weave these capillaries into more of our tissues because they're smaller. And to get these smaller capillaries, or these erythrocytes through smaller capillaries, we need smaller erythrocytes. To do that, we have smaller cells, so we dump out all the organelles once they're fully formed. But also, erythrocytes actually have several other different important functions as well, not just oxygen binding and transport. And these two are kind of at the top of that list. They're both actually related to each other. We'll come back to that in a while, but really bicarbonate production and also carbon dioxide transport are important functions of erythrocytes. And then finally also we have leukocytes, which are white blood cells. Again, these are working in the immune system. I'm not going to talk too often much about that. So that's kind of just a brief overview of what's going on with the circulatory system, and also looking at the fluid component. But now we're going to move on to the pump component and start talking about